Lable Braun is a gifted thinker with a diverse background. He is a philosopher who spent decades as a corporate executive. He is a mystic and a Phi Beta Kappa scholar. He reads tarot cards and is a certified project management professional. Above all, in each of these roles, his essence is that of storyteller, writer, and dynamic speaker. I'm delighted to welcome Lable Braun. What led to your thinking about patterns?
In 2005, I was asked to speak at a coaching conference, and I wanted to speak about the power of story. So I put up a slide on and asked the audience a question. One picture on the slide was of me as a little baby, very cute, I might say. And then I put up a slide of myself as an adult. And I asked them that science would tell us that there was not a single atom in my body right now that was in my body 10 years ago. And so the atoms have all recycled several times, turned over several times since I was that little baby. What makes that baby and my current self both me? Why do I have a sense of me? Why do others have a sense of me? And I tied it to story by saying that we share the same life story. That's what makes us both me. The pattern of our lives, the way things have gone, the subjective experiences, all of those things, what I've been taught by my culture, by my family, by my religion, by everyone around me, has formed a me that has some persistence in the shared patterns. And since then, it's still a topic that has really fascinated me. So I've done a lot of research into sociology, into neuroscience, and I found that there are patterns that persist that give us this sense of me. So that led me to wonder, what are these patterns all about? And am I these patterns? Is everybody a pattern of their experiences, a pattern of their biology and their DNA? And that's where I've landed on, that is the defining characteristic of what it is to have an ego, to have a me.
You talk a lot about the things that shape you, but there are geneticists right now that are saying it's all dictated by our genes. So much, even the genes of our grandparents have a big impact on us, and that environment is only a piece of it. Where do you fall in this argument?
I think we are prone to error whenever we think that there is a single cause of anything. The other big premise of where I am right now is that the universe is inextricably connected. And we are finding that to be the case on a physical level, on an emotional level, on any level you can imagine. Everything is connected. So I would find it very hard to believe, and I don't think the evidence is there, that it's solely genetic. They will talk about the twin studies and how alike twins are, even when they were separated and raised in different families. But what they don't talk about is how different the twins still are. So I think that's looking at half the picture and not at the other half. We must also remember that the genetic code is a pattern as well, and a pattern that we interact with all the time.
Well, you do write in these wonderful metaphors in all of your writing. You talk about lumps and bumps and how smooth everything really is, and it's our mind interpreting what we see. Say more about this.
So in the early universe, it was very, very flat. And we know this for a fact because people may have heard of the cosmic microwave background radiation, which pervades the entire universe. Anywhere you point a telescope, a radio telescope especially, you'll find the cosmic microwave background radiation. It is what's called isomorphic, in other words, the same, to 1 part in 100,000. And this was extant at the very beginning of the Big Bang. And if you measure its temperature still today, 13.7 billion years later, the temperature anywhere you pointed at the sky is the same to 1 part in 100,000. But due to quantum effects, 1 part in 100,000 makes a difference. So there are these little lumps that form apparently at random to us through quantum effects, and then gravitational, and they form little lumps that we would call protons or electrons or whatever, and then gravity takes over and clumps the lumps into shapes and patterns, but the shapes and patterns aren't intrinsic to nature. We see patterns. The human brain is a pattern-seeking machine. The best example I can give is the belief in the constellations. Actually, the perception of the constellations. We think we're looking at a two-dimensional surface, and so we make patterns out of the individual stars that could be hundreds or even thousands of light years from each other. They don't know they're associated. We associate them in our brains.
So let me just say this for the real layman on this. You're saying that, for example, the astrological signs that we see in the sky that go back before we knew the Earth was round, universe, that there was such a thing as the solar system, that these patterns were seen by us and designed by us, and in fact are not really there in that way.
Not there outside of our brains, and the reason our brains do that is because I mentioned we were pattern-seeking machines, and that's because we're meaning-seeking machines. And patterns give us the ability to create meaning out of how we view the patterns, which is tied to the third aspect that I would say, that we are control-seeking machines. Once there are patterns, we put meanings on them, and then we feel we have some control. And all of that is really, really good for living life the way that we live it, but we can't foist it on the universe.
Let's take a look at the biggest pattern of all that fascinates us all, and that is the pattern of life and death. It seems to me that we are, if it is a perception of the mind, we are locked into a belief system that there is this thing called the life's journey and then death. Maybe it's just a pattern.
I would come down on that side, that it's a pattern. And that's tied to where we started about the universe being so smooth, because the universe is very inhospitable to patterns. The universe likes things smooth, and any pattern that arises will have to fade away eventually. It is destined to fade away. The configuration that leads us to think there's a pattern changes. And it goes back in a lot of ways to the smoothness of it, which means we're a pattern that forms. Other people's brains see the pattern of us. We see the pattern of our own life. Those two don't always line up, by the way, which is why people can have false impressions of us. And one day it will fade away. The illusion is that the pattern will never fade away. I call it the dual delusions. There are two delusions which interact with each other. One is that we are not a pattern, we are something that has persistence through time and that will always exist. Yes, we know at a certain level we will die. Very few, very few live as if they really know they're going to die. And the second delusion is that we are somehow separate from the universe and that we are a unique and distinct pattern that's not connected to the larger pattern of the universe. They've actually, I was amazed to find this, they've actually located a place in the brain that keeps this delusion going. And if that place in the brain is turned off, either via injury or via drugs or via electric charge, we all of a sudden feel totally at one with the universe. We lose all sense of ourselves as a separate being. So in order to create this sense of ourselves as a separate being, we have to believe in ourselves as something that has persistence, that will last forever. And because we don't know where we're going once that pattern dissolves. And that might be a question that makes no sense. If our us, is that pattern, the question of where does it go when we no longer are that pattern is probably needs a higher level of consciousness to even delve, what does the question mean?
Lable, we could go deeper and deeper into a single question, and I'm going to resist the temptation because
Sure.
I think we're going to be talking many times on this program. So I'm going to stay with today's topic, but I'm tempted to want to talk about the limitations of language, even in the discussion of this. So, but that would be for the next topic. We talked a little bit about mythologies and astrology and perhaps even the tarot. But there is something called the Fibonacci sequence. This is a pattern that's even been written about in fiction. Dan Brown, who wrote about angels and demons and the Da Vinci Code, talked about the Fibonacci pattern. But in mathematics, this does exist. So is it not an actual pattern? It's not just a matter of perception, correct?
No, it's not. Well, the fact that it means something is a product of the mind. It does exist in nature. It's also very much tied to chaos theory, which is that all patterns will eventually have unpredictable effects. We don't like looking at that aspect of it because we like having control. We like certainty. We like being able to predict. So this pattern keeps showing up. And my question is, does it keep showing up or do we keep noticing it? It's there. But by itself, what would it do if there wasn't a human mind there to notice it? We give it meaning. And that's where I would break from people who say, okay, it is, God's signature on the universe. I think God's signature on the universe is the human mind and its ability to form the patterns and to recognize them. But it doesn't, we would have to have a long discussion about what does it mean for something to be there and what does it mean for something not to be there. If it's there only when we notice it, then is it really there? And quantum theory would tell us everything is only there when we notice it. So why not the Fibonacci sequence as well?
Well, I think this is going to show up. I'm going to encourage people who watch this to certainly put in their responses to this. I think there will be more questions for you coming out of this. Let's talk about your metaphor on the first half of life and the second half of life. I am intrigued by your thinking about the passage of time. Talk about this.
We've become a very binary society. I think for 100,000 years, humanity has been searching for certainty. And we've become the apex of that. We believe things as absolutely true or absolutely untrue. And we believe if things happen once, they're always going to happen. If things didn't happen once, they will never happen. We've become very, very binary in our thinking. And so we don't see those shades of gray. We don't necessarily see how things change over time. We think that if something is appropriate to be done or to be a certain way, it's always appropriate to be that way. So we believe we've become a society that believes, all right, learn the right way to do things, learn the right way to be, and be that way forever. Societies traditionally, and we spoke about mythologies before, and mythologies were built to support and promote this, that things change over time. And that an appropriate way to be at one point of your life is not necessarily an appropriate way to be at another point in your life. So I've called the first movement of life, and I won't say half because then we're going to get into an argument about where halves are, But like a symphony has different movements, and one can be longer than the other or shorter than the other. There are movements of our life. A symphony, by the way, is also a pattern. So it's a really good, analogy to me of what goes on in our lives. In that first movement, we're in what I call the inhale phase. We show up in the universe, and the pattern that is us shows up in the universe, and our first task is to create a me. As far as we can tell, and I don't know if that part of their brain isn't developed yet or not, but as far as we can tell, babies are born not seeing any separation between themselves and anything else. And so we over time inhale the universe, inhale the objects and the things that are in the universe and the processes. We inhale the resources of the universe. We inhale that there are other people, and we figure out how we relate to them. And we are creating an ego. And by the way, the word ego has gotten a bad rap. It's not a bad thing. It's a useful thing for a certain part of our lives, and it's appropriately used during that first movement of our life when we're trying to figure out what is it that we are doing here and how do we relate to everything else. But then comes a time where we have to start the work of preparing for our pattern dissolving. And that means dissolving the ego. And everything that we've inhaled in now has to be inhaled back out. Exhaled back out. We have to learn to let go of everything we've accumulated. We're not in accumulation phase anymore. So we reach a point in our life where we need to prepare for the certain knowledge that the pattern that is our lives will dissolve and disappear, which means we have to start dissolving this ego that we've built up. It was a useful tool for the first movement of life, and now we have to let it go. We have to do that in a way that gives back what we've inhaled in, our wisdom, even our resources, all of the emotions we've built up. And there used to be cultural support for doing that. It's interesting, if you look at both Dante in the West and the Hindu approach to the phases of life in the East, they line up almost exactly. And it's about the different businesses that we're about. And we have lost that cultural support for saying, things have changed, circumstances have changed, we have to change our approach. So we do one of two things. Either, or hopefully one of three things, let me change to that. Either we careen mindlessly through the rest of our lives, still trying to be as we were in that first movement. We accumulate. We like to have control. Our ego keeps growing. I've seen this so much, Phyllis, among people who retire and then try to recreate exactly the life they had while they were working. So that's not helpful to prepare for that final exhale that we need to do. Then one can exhale, but do it mindlessly. Just withdraw totally from the process of living. I kind of call that the waiting room of death. These are people who are just waiting for that final moment. Now, thankfully, I haven't met as much of those as I've met of the first type, because I think that's even sadder in a way, because we're not tying up loose ends. We are not moving our resources where they need to be. It's become, if you don't mind me injecting a little economics, it's become very fashionable to talk about how the 1% are tying up all the resources in this country and in the world. And that is true. But the real problem from my perspective that keeps people, young adults and even middle-aged people at the subsistence level is that the baby boom generation has locked up all the resources in their 401ks and pensions and those kinds of things, and in houses that are much bigger than they need and those kind of things, and are not releasing the resources back, not letting go, not exhaling those resources. So I think there's a problem with the waiting room of death as well. What I recommend and what I've tried to practice is a mindful approach to exhaling. I call it exhaling exquisitely. Mindfully going back and, first of all, re-examining our lives. And more than re-examining them, reframing them. Much of the experiences of our lives are locked up in our mind at the level of consciousness at which they were experienced. So a traumatic event happened to me when I was 8 years old. Unless I do the work, I'm always going to experience that event in terms of an 8-year-old can understand it. But if I take the wisdom and experience and communication and love that I've gathered up over the 57 years since that happened and look at that event again with that level of consciousness, I can reframe it and see that it was one of the greatest gifts that was ever given to me. And once I see that, I'm ready to let it go.
I think the average listener, Lable, and you can pull back and say no to this, but I think the average listener, once you mention something like that, will want to know what happened to you at 8 years old.
What happened to me when I was 8 years old is I had problems making friends. The other aspect of this is that I was raised in an Orthodox Jewish community, and at that point, I believed there was an absolute truth, and the rabbis had that absolute truth and were communicating it to me. Well, we moved neighborhoods, and so now I was a person who didn't have a lot of friend skills in a very new environment, and I knew no one, but I made one really good friend. And one Passover, the first year that we were friends, my friend was going down to Washington, D.C. from Brooklyn. His family was going to spend the holidays with his grandfather. In order to teach us a precept of the Talmud, the source of Jewish knowledge and wisdom and legalities, the rabbi told us that the Talmud says that when you're on your way to do a good deed, God watches over you. Mm-hmm. So that he would be watched over during the trip. We collected charity in the class for him to deposit in the charity box in his grandfather's synagogue when he got there, so that he'd be on his way to do a good deed and God will watch over him. Well, in the Northeast, that time of year tends to be really very foggy. And they were driving down I-95 in a terrible pea soup fog. They got a flat tire. His father pulled over to the side, what he thought was the side of the road, and the semi who ran over them never even saw them. He was still in the main road. My friend, his brother, his father was killed. His little baby sister was terribly harmed. His mother never recovered from the experience. So here it is, it's Passover, and I am dying to go back to school, to be yeshiva, because I've not only lost my best friend, my only friend, I've lost my understanding of how the universe works. He had charity money on him that he was going to deposit. He was supposed to be watched over. And when we got back, the principal of the school pulled us all together, and this is still etched in my memory at an 8-year-old level. The principal of the school got up, and the first thing he said was, "We don't understand why these things happen." Mm. And I can still remember my reaction. You don't understand why these things happen? For these 8 years of my life, you've been telling me you understand everything and know everything, and all I have to do is follow what you tell me to do, and I'll be leading a good life. And now you tell me you don't know why these things happen. And that was, as I just said, a tremendous dual loss, the loss of the relationship between this other boy that I loved and the ground completely falling away from under my feet, and there was no certainty about anything anymore. Now, for a lot of my life, I've seen that as traumatic, but I understand it now as tremendously freeing, as setting me on the road and helping me see that it's up to me to make sense of this life, and I can't outsource it to anybody else.
And your understanding that this was a gift to you, yes, and that you now have been on this continuous search. One of the things I want to thank you for is the idea that this is an activity that all of us can benefit from being engaged in, that the idea of not necessarily knowing the answers, but the process of looking,
yes,
is valuable in itself. So this program is devoted to, and we have more to talk about, but this program is devoted to those individuals who are going out and looking for information, looking for answers, exploring ideas, and exchanging those ideas, not with the sense that I'm right and you're wrong, but more with the just human curiosity to see what can we learn, what more can we learn.
I think the first thing we're talking about a movement of life where we have to let go of things. I think the first thing we have to let go of, what is most important to be on that search, is to let go of the idea of certainty. Let go of the idea that we have it now or can ever have it. The main metaphor I have in my life right now is, it's a little bit of a cliche, but it is what drives my life now, is that of the 10 blind people who are all touching a different part of the elephant. And one of them thinks the elephant is like a rope because they're touching the tail. And the other one thinks the elephant is like a tree trunk because they're touching the leg. And another one thinks the elephant is like a saber because they're touching the tusks. So what I am interested in is not a description of the elephant. We can never come to know the elephant. But I want to talk to other people and say, what part of the elephant have you touched? What have you found of the nature of this elephant we call reality? What is your experience of it? Because that enriches my experience, whether it's the same as my experience or it's not the same as my experience.
Well, going to that experience, I want to go to a specific word in your usage. Mm-hmm. You talk about exquisitely exhaling. Mm-hmm. So what is the exquisiteness in this practice? What does it mean to exhale exquisitely?
So I mentioned before, and for me, this is where the exquisiteness lies, and thank you for making that clear, is that it's a mindful approach. We are meeting our own needs. If you see anybody write a prescription for how this process is to be done, run. It needs to be done in your own way because you are a different pattern than I am. I can talk about certain approaches like reframing the past, like identifying more with the universal than the particular. I could go on with those things, but how you do those things has to speak of Phyllis or whoever is watching this. It has to be your patterns unwinding. It does, just as it would have done you no good to live my pattern, that's my job. It would do nobody any good to unwind my pattern. They have to unwind their own pattern. And when you do it in a mindful way, knowing that there's no right or wrong way to do it, but you're in touch with your truest self, then I think the process is exquisite, not only for you, but for everyone you touch and come into contact with.
All right, now there's something that kind of causes a little conflict for me in the concept. There are studies that show that many of the great discoveries, much of the great wealth, happens when people are in between 55 and 65, or even between 55 and 75. For some people, this is a time of extraordinary creativity. Mm-hmm. So when you're talking about unwinding, you're not talking about necessarily diminishing.
Oh, definitely not diminishing. I'm talking about freeing. The unwinding has to do with taking off all the certainties that we built up in order to establish our ego and who we are. And it was absolutely necessary for that movement of life. I'm not judging anybody for that. But we get to a point where it's kind of like my car. I'm sure that I have a very nice car if I would ever wash it and get down to where the car actually is and let it shine through. The unwinding is taking off all the certainties and even more so all the obligations that we've built up over the life that allows the true beauty and creativity of ourselves to show through.
So it's that process that Japanese sculptors talk about, that it's whittling away the stone to see what beauty is there already underneath. And
Absolutely.
It's not necessarily giving everything up, which you can do, but it's more a process of discovery.
It as you say, removing what isn't the statue, and we've built up a crust around ourselves by the time that we get ready to exhale of what is not us, of what we've been told to believe, or what we've had to believe or practice in order to belong to a certain tribe that we want to belong to. All of these things that are not us, that are keeping the gem from being seen. And that's what I mean by unwinding, freeing the creative, beautiful you that's been there all along, but has had obligations that have kept it from shining through.
Lable, just a couple more questions, because we could talk until dawn the next day. There's some phrases like, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. I would like your input on this. It seems to me that if you get rid of the stuff you don't need anymore, you have room to learn a lot more.
You have room to learn more than you ever have before. You are open to understanding yourself, the universe, and everything. One of my favorite stories is about the Buddha under the Bodhi tree, the night that he achieved enlightenment. And he faced 3 challenges. And the challenge of fear and the challenge of appetite, he dealt with very, very quickly. What kept him under the tree for most of the night, and the hardest thing for him to deal with, the final challenge, was social obligation. That, he had a child, he had his father who was a king with his expectations of him, he had the expectations of his followers, all of these obligations he had, and only by letting go of those could he achieve enlightenment. The ultimate creativity, especially during the exhale phase, where we identify more with the universe and the cosmos and all there is than with any particulars, the challenge there is to let go of the obligations, because those patterns of obligation are very deep in us and they don't go quietly. So yes, doing this unleashes creativity, not stifles it.
That is the subject for an entirely new discussion, because that might require the change of a social construct.
Yes.
Because our whole society is even built on the idea that you owe your life to your family, whether you're a working man or a grandmother taking care of grandchildren, or the whole social construct does not talk about the freedom of the person who has lived their life and now wants to go explore. So I think that's going to be room. I just want to make sure I have asked you everything that I wanted to about exhaling and inhaling. Here's a question I didn't ask you. How is inhaling, let's say, in the second half of life, which is when you're supposed to be exhaling, how is it? How does it feel to discover something new? What happens to you when you shift gears and start living this clearer version of yourself?
Of course, inhaling happens during the second movement of life. I wouldn't want anybody to hyperventilate. But here I'm going to use a word which has become used so much that sometimes it's not understood. You know what happens when we assume we know what a word means? And that's the concept of intention. When we inhale, first of all, I think the ratio of inhale to exhale changes during the second movement. And you were kind enough to point me to something I didn't know about yogic breathing, in which the exhale is held for twice as long as the inhale is. And that sounds like a pretty good ratio for the second movement of life, maybe even more. You've told me that there are some yogis who can even get the ratio way beyond that. So yes, there is some inhaling to be done, but what's the intention? When we inhale during the first movement of life, the question we immediately ask is, how can I use this? What can I do with it? And that's fine and appropriate for the first movement in life. When you are in the exhaling exquisitely movement of life, you inhale, something new comes in, and your first question usually is, how can I share this? How can I make this of service to others who might still be in the inhale movement of life, or others who are exhaling? How can I share this and express the connectedness of the universe with what I've just inhaled? And that difference in intention makes all the difference.
Lable Braun, thank you for sharing your exhalation with me and with others. I am sure we're going to continue this conversation. We're going to have more conversations. I really value this, and I encourage people to email us and write to us, and I will share that with you, Labels, because I think you've opened up as many questions as you've answered. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Phyllis. It is always an exquisite pleasure to be in conversation with you.